I'm not sure if this is common knowledge or not, but did you know that riding in third class on the Titanic was actually pretty decent? It might have been the cheapest way to travel on the ship, but it wasn't nearly as bad as what people imagine today. In fact, it was better than you think, and there were even some perks to it. In this video, we'll take a look at some of those things that most people don't know about, like the price of a ticket and how you could get your very own private room. These things and more coming up. So let's get started. Before we talk about the amenities in third class though, let's talk about how much it cost, because that is something that people are surprised by all the time. A first class ticket on the Titanic was extremely expensive back in the day, costing about $348 in 1911. If you want to see what that would be in today's money, you can visit an online inflation calculator. And according to that, $348 in 1911 is equal to about $11,000 today. So yeah, first class was expensive, but that also means that third class was very cheap in comparison. It cost only around $30 for a third class ticket from Southampton to New York. That's less than the equivalent of 1 week's worth of food in today's money. The average ticket price across all classes was around $26. So third class was cheaper than average. But this brings us to another thing that surprises people about third class. It was actually a really good deal when compared to other forms of transportation at the time. Most people don't realize that traveling on the Titanic was cheaper than traveling by train, or even taking a trip across the ocean on another ship. People who lived in Britain during that time period had two main options when it came to getting to America. They could either travel by sea or by rail. It took around 7 days to cross the Atlantic by sea, but it was a lot cheaper than taking the train. At the time, there were transatlantic trains where you could board in London and travel to a port in the U.S. Midwest by rail. But that journey took 10 days. Even if you went from London to New York City directly, it would still take 5 days. All of that time, passengers were crammed into a train car with limited access to food and other amenities. We should also mention that the total travel time would have been longer because passengers would have had to make transfers along the way. As you can probably already guess, they didn't have those high-speed trains like they do today. So it might not have been the fastest way to get to America. But traveling on the Titanic was definitely one of the cheaper ways to do it, especially considering that it was a luxurious experience. Let's talk about that now. When you hear about the sinking of the Titanic, you're probably imagining scenes like this one, where people are scrambling onto lifeboats and trying to stay warm in the freezing water. But that wasn't really the case for most of the passengers who traveled on the Titanic. Instead, people described the ship as being more like a floating hotel. While the higher classes lived in luxury, the third-class passengers were living pretty comfortably too. To start off, the accommodations were decent. The beds were simple, but they were made out of metal, which is something that would have been considered luxurious at the time. This was because the materials used to build the beds and furniture in third class were more durable and wouldn't break as easily. They were also able to withstand the moisture and pests that would normally accumulate in the lower decks. The cabins themselves weren't all that different from the higher classes either. There were cushioned walls and even curtains for privacy. They also had portholes so passengers could look out at the ocean. Some rooms even had fancy wallpaper borders and drapes. Of course, the nicer rooms were reserved for the higher classes, but the third-class passengers still got their own private space, which was more than you could say for most other forms of transport at the time. Most train cars didn't even have separate sleeping compartments, and people had to lie down on benches while they traveled. Food was also better on the Titanic than other forms of transport, despite what many people think. People tend to assume that because there were separate dining areas for different classes, that the third-class food must have been terrible. But that was not necessarily the case. In fact, the menu for third class was exactly the same as the other classes, meaning that everyone ate the same foods at the same times. third-class passengers just had to eat in the lower-level dining rooms. We should also mention that eating schedules were the same for every class, unlike the hours for sleeping accommodations. While second and third-class passengers could choose to sleep in shifts so that someone was always awake, there were no such rules for the first-class passengers. They slept when they wanted to and ate when they wanted to, so it makes sense that the meals would be the same. As for what they ate, the food was mostly standard fare for the time period, consisting of meats like chicken, beef, and pork, along with vegetables and fruits. Sometimes they had special treats like plum pudding and waffles. There was also alcohol available for purchase. Passengers could buy beer, wine, and spirits at the bar, although they could also bring their own aboard. The only difference between the food for first, second, and third class was that the higher classes got more of it. For example, first-class passengers got 6 dishes at breakfast, while third-class passengers got 4. There was also afternoon tea for first and second class, which wasn't offered to third-class passengers. However, these differences weren't that big of a deal since everyone was still served the same quality of food. Another perk of third class was that the passengers had more freedom than the higher classes. Because of the social norms of the time, first and second class passengers were expected to behave in a certain way. They were supposed to follow a strict code of conduct and adhere to a dress code. They also couldn't go to certain parts of the ship, like the lower decks. Third-class passengers did not have to worry about any of that. They were free to roam the ship wherever they wanted, and there were some places that were off limits to the higher classes, but open to the third-class passengers. For example, they could go to the gym, which was located in the lower decks. Also, unlike first and second-class passengers, third-class passengers could travel with their pets. Now, we don't know how many people took advantage of this because no animals survived the sinking, but it was a perk nonetheless. It should also be said that some people argue that surviving the sinking of the Titanic was easier if you were in third class. This is due to the fact that the upper decks were more damaged after the collision, and that meant that it was harder to escape. Also, more lifeboats arrived at the lower decks earlier. Now, there were definitely some downsides to traveling in third class. The biggest one was that the passengers had a shorter life expectancy than those in the higher classes. This isn't because of anything related to the quality of life or the accommodations, but rather because of the fact that third-class passengers were more likely to be single men. Of the third-class passengers, 62% were male and only 17% were women. The majority of them were young too, which is another factor that played into their life expectancy. In general, people who are younger and single tend to die sooner than those who are older and married. Take a look at this graph showing the average age of death for people by marital status. You can see that single men died at the youngest age, followed by single women. Then married men and women had a longer life expectancy. But regardless of marital status, third-class passengers were more likely to die young, simply because they were more likely to be single men than the higher classes. We should also mention that many people who traveled in third class were immigrants. About 3/4 of the passengers in third class were immigrants who were traveling to America in search of new lives. Unfortunately, the Titanic was supposed to be one of the last passenger ships that they would ever ride, but it was. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. And remember to subscribe so you never miss one of our videos. In this video, we are going to take a closer look at one of the least explored parts of the Titanic, that being inside the ship's steerage area, more specifically third class. I'll be showing some previously unseen photographs and talking about what life was like in this part of the ship. Third class on the Titanic is one of the most talked about subjects when it comes to the sinking of the Titanic. But despite this, very little remains of it today. The ship's captain, Edward Smith, was found strapped to his bed in the first-class area of the ship after it sank, but the bodies of 2/3 of the passengers and crew were never recovered, many of which were in the third-class area. This has led to a lot of myths and misconceptions over the years. Today, we will be focusing on what the space itself looked like, based on photographs taken before the sinking of the Titanic. Steerage was an area of the ship that was below the main deck and above the cargo holds. It was divided into 3 classes, with third class being the lowest. Unlike today, back then, there were no rules or regulations for how ships should be built. This meant that the only thing separating the passengers from the cargo in the holds was the thin wooden floorboards. There was also no separate dining room for third-class passengers, so they would eat their meals in their cabins, which were cramped and barely ventilated. Despite this, though, it wasn't all bad news. They did have access to the steerage decks, which were located at the top of the steerage area. Here, passengers could breathe some fresh air and get away from the claustrophobic conditions in the lower parts of the ship. These decks were also where most of the third-class passengers disembarked at their destinations. A good example of this can be seen in this photograph of the ship alongside an open lifeboat. You can see here that the gangway was set up from the top of the steerage deck to the lifeboat. On the day the Titanic sank, this is likely how the majority of third-class passengers would have gotten off the ship in New York. Another perk for third-class passengers was that they had access to some of the ship as common rooms. For example, in the bow of the ship was a large saloon which could hold around 460 people, making it the largest public room in the steerage area. The walls and ceilings were decorated with paintings and wood carvings to make it feel less institutional. In another photograph taken inside the saloon, we can see here that the tables and benches were placed in rows, and it had been cleared out for the day, suggesting that eating was done at other times. Also, the benches were likely folded up to maximize floor space. At the time the ship sank, there would have been many third-class passengers in this room. Some may have been eating dinner, whilst others were socializing and playing games. This room, however, was not solely used by third-class passengers. For example, the second-class smoking room was also located inside the bow, as shown in this photograph of the ship's second-class passenger, Francis Daniels, standing outside the entrance. When he was questioned later, Daniels said that he was enjoying a quiet smoke in his favorite corner of the room when he heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find a stewardess telling him to come see something funny. She had meant for him to come see a comedian who was performing on the other side of the room. However, the look on Daniel's face suggested otherwise, and the stewardess soon told him about the iceberg. Next, we'll move to the ship's rear, where at the bottom of the stairs was the third-class dining saloon. The saloons for first and second class were much larger, suggesting that the amount of food available to third-class passengers was far less. We know that third-class passengers had a set menu that changed daily, and it consisted of basic foods such as meat, potatoes, and bread. And occasionally, fruit and biscuits were also served. The dining saloon was also sometimes referred to as the drill hall, because it was also used as a space to practice emergency procedures. One of the lesser-known areas of the steerage area is the hospital located at the rear of the ship. This was equipped with 4 beds and was intended for treating minor injuries and illnesses. In the first-class area, there was a much larger medical suite with 8 beds. But unlike the first-class medical suite, the one in steerage was staffed by a single person only, a German immigrant named Gustav Loren. With no formal medical training, he was essentially the ship's handy man, carrying out odd jobs whenever asked. Loren claimed that on the evening of April, he treated a woman for a nosebleed, after which she went to her cabin and died. Later that night, he was awoken by a passenger who came to tell him that her sister had a bad cough and asked if he could come see her. Loren claims that he saw the woman and returned to his bunk without treating her. As he didn't want to be bothered, the next morning, Loren says that he attended to several people who complained of headaches. One of these passengers was 21-year-old Sidney Leslie, who died later that day. While the exact cause of death for Leslie isn't known, it is possible that Lauren's treatment, or lack thereof, contributed to his passing. Just like the rest of the steerage area, the hospital was largely destroyed during the sinking, leaving us with very few clues as to what it looked like. However, using photographs of similar hospitals on other ships, we can get an idea of how it may have appeared. This photo shows the hospital on board the nearby ship the captain was transferred to after the sinking. And Captain Smith's body was found wrapped in a blanket on a bunk. This suggests that Lauren likely used the beds to store bodies after passengers died. Lauren himself survived the sinking and gave testimony of what he had seen that night. He described how the floor was littered with dead bodies and said that the water in the sinks was filled with them. He also said that the water in the sinks was used to drown out the screams of those dying in the other cabins. As mentioned earlier, steerage was located under the cargo holds and above the waterline, so when the ship began to sink, it likely flooded fairly quickly. Because of this, many of the third-class passengers probably didn't have much time to prepare. Also, due to the lack of rules and regulations back then, once the ship began to go down, there was nothing stopping the cargo from shifting, which would have made moving around even more difficult. Another factor to consider was the fact that many passengers probably didn't believe that the ship was actually sinking. This was because the lifeboats and the captain of the nearby ship saw flares, believing them to be fireworks. Also, the crew were instructed to not spread any panic among the passengers. As we now know, this ended up being a fatal mistake. The last and final area of the third-class area that I'd like to discuss is the cabins. These were extremely cramped and were shared by multiple people at a time. In this photo, we can see a typical third-class cabin on the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. The beds are bunks, which fold down from the walls and are separated by curtains. In total, there were 834 third-class cabins on the Titanic, with the majority of them looking like the one just shown. There was also a smaller number of single-person cabins, which looked like the ones in this photograph. The walls were covered in fabric to prevent the sounds echoing around the ship. A total of 1,285 people occupied the third-class cabins on the Titanic, including 793 passengers and 492 crew members. Of these, just over half lived to tell the tale. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like as it helps the channel tremendously. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one. For 90 years, we have heard the story of the Titanic and pitied the first-class passengers who perished in the disaster. But what about the other passengers? How did the steerage passengers die? What is their story? Let's find out. On April 14th, 1911, at 11:40 p.m., an author by the name of Morgan Robertson wrote to his wife and children, "I must tell you that today was my 46th birthday. So you see, I am now 46 years old. I was only 45 yesterday." He signed it off with "Love to all, Morgan." Little did he know, this would be the last letter he would ever write. Morgan Robertson was one of the steerage passengers on board the Titanic. Steerage is the area of a ship where passengers are transported in the lowest deck, which is the closest to the bottom of the ship. It is also the cheapest place to stay in the ship, so these were mostly immigrant families who boarded the ship in Europe for a better life in America. Their conditions were far from ideal. The rooms were cramped and the air was stale. Many of them were already sick before they even boarded the Titanic, and those who weren't were soon affected by the outbreak of the flu on board. Despite all of this, they were hopeful because the ship was supposedly unsinkable. On the morning of April 15th, some of the steerage passengers came up on deck to get some fresh air and to watch the sunrise. It must have been quite the sight to see, but many were too afraid to go on deck because of the cold. The sea was freezing, so only a few people took this opportunity. Among them was a mother of 2 young children. She wanted to take a picture of her family watching the sunrise. but she couldn't get everyone in the frame. So she asked a fellow passenger to take the picture for her, but she never got that picture taken. Her name was Margaret Tobin. Her husband John was wary of going on deck because of the cold, and he preferred to stay inside and look out of the porthole. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, there were screams everywhere. People ran around not knowing what to do. John Tobin woke up and went to the door to check what was going on. He saw people running around like headless chickens. When he looked outside, he saw the most terrifying sight he had ever seen. They were surrounded by icebergs. One of the passengers shouted, "Beware of the icebergs." John then rushed to wake his wife. "Icebergs," he screamed at her. John grabbed life jackets for himself and his wife, but there were no life jackets for their children. He tried to calm his wife down, saying that they would be fine, but he was just saying that to comfort her. He knew they were all going to die. As the panic spread through the ship, many people ran to the upper decks to try and escape. This included people from steerage. Some people believed that if they reached the top of the ship, they could jump into the water and swim away to safety. Instead, they jumped into the freezing waters to their death. Those who stayed in the steerage class were either locked in their cabins or were too scared to move. They knew that whatever happened, it wouldn't be good. Soon, the ship started to break apart. There was nothing left to do. One of the survivors later described how it looked when the ship broke apart. The ship was ripped apart in two halves, and there was a brilliant flash of light. This was followed by a heavy crash, the force of which shook me from head to toe. Immediately afterwards, the whole of the forward part of the vessel sank beneath the surface, taking with it over 200 souls. Those who were sleeping in the forward cabins had no chance of escape and were all lost. Some of the women gave birth on the Titanic that night, but unfortunately, neither the mothers nor the babies survived. An author who was also a passenger on board, Morgan Robertson, was woken up in the middle of the night by a fellow passenger. "Get up, quick up," he yelled. "The ship is sinking." Morgan didn't believe him until he felt the ship tilt. In his last moments, he made the decision to leave his cabin and stand on the top deck to await rescue. On the top deck, he saw something that made him feel less alone. It was an author named William T. Stead. William was a journalist who was highly respected in England. He was also an author who predicted the sinking of the Titanic in a fictional story that he wrote 14 years before it happened. He wrote a story about a captain who ignored warnings of an iceberg and crashed into one. The story ended with the passengers abandoning ship and being rescued. It seemed unbelievable that the same thing would happen to him, but it was already too late for him and for Morgan Robertson. Both men died along with more than 1,500 others. Only 7 lifeboats were scheduled for that day, but 6 were canceled due to bad weather, leaving only 1 lifeboat to search for survivors. Most of the survivors had life jackets on, but those in steerage didn't have that luxury. The lifeboat arrived at the scene, but they could only pull out a few people. Many of the people who had life jackets on were close to hypothermia when they were pulled out of the water. Most of the people without life jackets were already dead when the lifeboat arrived. The few survivors were taken to nearby towns, but they were so traumatized by the experience that many of them died soon after reaching land. Among those who died was a man named Benjamin, who was traveling with his wife and daughter. All 3 of them survived the sinking of the ship, but they all died from the cold. Benjamin was the first to go. His wife and daughter kept walking until they collapsed from exhaustion. When they were found, they were brought to a nearby hospital, but they had both passed away. Out of the 706 passengers in steerage, only about 100 survived. Many of the survivors later sued the company that owned the Titanic for negligence. They said that if the ship wasn't overcrowded, they might have had a better chance of surviving. Also, many of them didn't have life jackets, which would have increased their chances of survival. After the sinking of the Titanic, many changes were made to ensure that this would never happen again. One of the biggest changes was the requirement for ships to carry enough life jackets for everyone on board. This was not always the case, as some life jackets were often broken or damaged. This meant that many people who could have survived did not, because they did not have access to a life jacket. Another change made after the sinking of the Titanic was the creation of the International Ice Patrol. This group was responsible for monitoring icebergs in the North Atlantic Ocean and warning ships of their presence. Before the sinking of the Titanic, there was no such thing as an iceberg patrol, and many ships, including the Titanic, did not carry lifeboats. The next time you watch a movie about the Titanic, remember the steerage passengers. Remember that many of them were immigrants who were trying to escape poverty and make a new life for themselves in America. Remember also the children who died, the babies who never had a chance. These are the untold stories of the Titanic that we should remember. We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know what you think in the comments below. If you liked this video, please subscribe so you don't miss any of our future videos. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. The year is 1911. You've saved for years to take your family on a long-awaited vacation. The White Star Line has given you the deal of a lifetime. Passage on the new and largest ship in the world, the Titanic, from Southampton to New York, for you and your 2 children. It will only cost £25, less than $35. Compared to first class, which costs over 100 times that amount, third class is cramped and uncomfortable. But it is also filled with people just like you, who are excited to start their new lives in America. For those of us traveling in steerage, life on the Titanic is about to get real interesting. Come spend a day in their shoes. We wake up bright and early, well before the sun rises, to the gentle rocking of the ship. Although we paid extra to have a cabin all to ourselves, there isn't much room to spare. In fact, most third-class cabins are so tiny, they only come with 1 small window and 2 bunks stacked on top of each other. Families are lucky if they can get a cabin to themselves. Often several families share 1 bathroom, while some are even forced to use the facilities outside on the deck. Thankfully, today is a beautiful, sunny day, and the weather forecast predicts calm seas. So we uncurl ourselves from our makeshift beds, brush our teeth using the water from the communal taps, and dress quickly. Breakfast time, we join the other passengers making their way to the third-class dining room. There is a set menu for the day, consisting of porridge, bacon, eggs, bread, butter, tea, and milk. It may not sound like much, but it's better than what we had on the long and uncomfortable journey over here. On the first day, we were served cold biscuits and salty pork, along with stale fruitcake for dessert. While we eat, we listen to the chatter around us. Our table is full of immigrants from Ireland, and we hear stories about how they left their homeland due to the potato famine and the lack of jobs. Many of them are heading to Boston, where relatives have already settled and have work waiting for them. At another table sits a group of men who've decided to become cowboys in America. They tell jokes and play cards, smoking cigars and drinking beer. Next to them are 2 women who've decided to make America their home after being exploited by their employers in England. They whisper to each other, planning their futures in their newly adopted country. After breakfast, we watch as the crew clears the tables and prepares for the lunch service. Soon we are eating roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, followed by bread, cheese, and apples. It feels good to be fed regularly once again, but we notice that food seems to be in shorter supply than usual. We ask one of the waiters, and he tells us that they're re-rationing the supplies until they can figure out what caused the shortage. He tries to reassure us that everything is fine, and for now, we believe him. After lunch, the kids want to go and see the sights. They beg us to let them go to the first-class pool. As the biggest attraction on board, it should be off limits to third-class passengers. But since their father, Captain Smith, is so beloved by everyone, We know he would never stop us from taking our children to the pool. We walk past the second-class lounge, decorated in oak and mahogany, and then we enter the first-class pool area. We sit on the benches lining the pool and let the children enjoy themselves swimming in the heated indoor pool. While the kids are having fun, we talk with a couple of first-class passengers we met earlier. They seem shocked to hear that anyone would travel on the lower decks and question why we didn't pay for first class. We explain that we simply couldn't afford it, but they don't seem convinced. They try to convince us to switch to first class, but there's no way we could afford it now. Still, we thank them for their kindness and enjoy watching our children play. Soon it's time to leave. We follow the children onto the pool deck and watch them run back down to the third-class area. When we turn to leave, we hear screams and commotion coming from above. A lifeboat has just been lowered into the sea, and the captain's voice booms across the ship. There's been an accident, and many of the first-class passengers have gone missing. As we get closer, we hear him say there's been a lifeboat and to stay calm. We look at each other in confusion, but we aren't worried yet. Back in the steerage dining room, we are enjoying dinner when we hear a knock on the door. A nervous crew member stands in the doorway and tells us to put our life jackets on. But before we can panic, he explains the captain wants us to put them on just in case. Nothing more than that. Relieved, we dress the children and ourselves in the bulky yellow jackets. It feels weird to wear them around the cabin, so we head up on deck. The crew member points to lifeboats being lowered into the ocean and asks if we know anyone on the boat. We shake our heads, confused, but we're starting to get scared. We watch the boats return with only a few people on each. Suddenly, the same crew member comes back inside to grab more life jackets. He doesn't look back. He's pale and his hands are shaking. We pull our children close, hoping this is all just a big mistake. But then a crew member runs through the crowd, yelling, "Women and children first." And we finally realize something is wrong. We rush to the lifeboats and climb aboard. One of the crew members helps us onto the boat and hands us lifebuoys. We wave goodbye to the Titanic and try to comfort our crying children. As we're rowed away from the Titanic, we see more lifeboats arrive and we cheer, assuming they've come to rescue the other passengers. But we quickly realize that isn't true, because instead of rescuing people, they're towing away the lifeboats that were on the Titanic. We watch in horror as the lights on the ship go out one by one. People on the other boats begin calling out to the crew, but there's no response. At this point, we understand the gravity of the situation. The ship that was deemed unsinkable has sunk, and there was no other ship nearby to help. Most of us will never see our loved ones again. Luckily, we are rescued by the captain of the nearby ship and taken off the lifeboat. We shiver uncontrollably, hugging our children tightly. Some of the people on the other lifeboats weren't so lucky and drowned in the freezing waters. We think of those still on the ship, including the kind crew members who helped us get off the ship. We pray that they made it off before the end. As we step onto the captain's ship, we are given dry clothes, hot drinks, and blankets. We're safe, but we can't help but wonder why some people got off and others didn't. Why did the ship sink? And why did the lifeboats come for us, but not the others? We don't have the answers to these questions, and will probably never know the truth. All we know is that we survived the sinking of the Titanic. Thank you for watching. What would you do if you were on the Titanic? Let me know in the comments. Also, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of my videos. I'll see you next time. Bye.